I learned a long time ago that silence is often mistaken for weakness by people who have never had to earn anything. For 6 years, I was the quiet pillar holding up the crumbling ceiling of the Miller family. I paid the mortgages, covered the medical bills, and quietly funded the lifestyle my husband, Mark, claimed was the result of his own hard work. It was a comfortable lie that they all lived in, and for a while I let them. I thought being the bigger person meant absorbing the insults and the slights for the sake of peace. But peace has a high price, and on the night of my in-laws' 30th anniversary, I realized I had already paid too much. It wasn't enough that I had paid for the 5-course catering from the city's top bistro. It wasn't enough that I had spent my entire Saturday decorating their backyard with $3,000 worth of lilies and silk linens. The moment the first guest arrived, my mother-in-law, Brenda, cornered me in the kitchen. She didn't say thank you. She didn't even look at my face. She just handed me a stiff, white lace apron and told me that the servers were too slow. She said the family needed someone they could trust to handle the vintage crystal. She called it helping out, but we both knew what it was. She wanted the neighbors to see me as the help. She wanted to remind me that despite my marriage, I was an outsider who existed only to facilitate their comfort. Mark didn't say a word when he saw me walking through the crowd with a heavy silver tray. He just winked at me and asked for a refill on his scotch. I watched him lean into a group of his old college friends, bragging about the new investment portfolio he had supposedly built. In reality, that portfolio was a gift from my late grandfather, and Mark didn't even have the login credentials for the account. My thumb brushed the edge of the tray as I moved toward Brenda's circle of friends. They were the kind of women who wore their husbands' achievements like heavy jewelry. One of them, a woman named Diane, looked me up and down with a pitying smile. She asked Brenda if I was still doing that little bookkeeping job at the local firm. Brenda laughed, a sharp, thin sound that cut through the music. She told Diane that I was still playing around with my spreadsheets, but that it was good for me to stay busy since I didn't have any real responsibilities like the rest of the Miller women. She called my career a hobby, a way to pass the time while Mark provided our life. I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. I knew what it was. My attorney had been pinging me all afternoon. The final documents for my great-aunt's estate were ready for my digital signature. It wasn't just a few $1,000s or a piece of land. It was a multi-million-dollar transition that included the very house we were standing in, which the family had unknowingly put up as collateral for a business loan I had quietly bought out months ago to save them from their own stupidity. I was the secret owner of their world, and here I was, being mocked for being a bookkeeper. I looked at Brenda, who was complaining that the champagne was slightly too warm. I looked at Mark, who was laughing at a joke he didn't understand. The contrast was almost funny. On one hand, you had a family that defined their worth by the service they could demand from others. On the other hand, you had me, the woman they treated like a ghost, who currently held their entire future in an encrypted file on a mobile device. I didn't get angry. I didn't drop the tray. I simply smiled, refilled Diane's glass, and felt the weight of the silver in my hands. I stood there, holding a tray of champagne for people who didn't even know my last name. But they were about to learn it on a legal summons. I drove home that night in a silence so thick it felt like it was pressing against my ribs. Beside me, Mark was humming, scrolling through his phone to see which photos of the party looked best for his social media. He hadn't thanked me for the catering. He hadn't asked if my feet ached from 4 hours of playing waitress. He just muttered something about how his mother thought the napkins were a bit stiff. It was the same script he had been reading from since our 2nd year of marriage. Back then, I told myself that his family's entitlement was just a quirk of their upbringing, something I could smooth over with enough kindness and hard work. I was raised in a house where your word was your bond, and you didn't sit down until the chores were done. My father worked 2 jobs so I could go to college debt-free, and he taught me that the greatest power a person can have is the ability to provide for themselves. I brought that work ethic into my marriage like a shield. When Mark's consulting business stalled for the 3rd year in a row, I quietly picked up the slack. I told him it was okay, that we were a team. I started paying the mortgage on the house his parents had gifted us, which turned out to be a property so heavily leveraged they were weeks away from foreclosure. I paid the back taxes. I paid the utility bills that arrived in pink envelopes. I even paid for the gas in the luxury SUV Mark drove to lunch meetings where he would tell his friends about his latest six-figure wins. I was the silent engine, the hidden battery keeping their entire charade running. The worst part wasn't the money, though. It was the way they looked at me while they spent it. Mark would take his parents to five-star dinners on my dime, and when I couldn't make it because I was working overtime to cover the bill, they would tell him it was a shame I didn't have a real, executive career that allowed for a social life. They treated my income like a shameful secret that paid for their very public arrogance. Brenda once told me, with a straight face, that it must be hard for me to understand the pressures of high-level living since I came from such humble stock. She said this while wearing a diamond tennis bracelet I had bought for her as a birthday gift because Mark had forgotten his wallet. I looked at Mark's profile in the dim light of the dashboard. He was handsome, but it was the kind of beauty that only exists because it has never known the stress of a real consequence. He was a parasite who had convinced himself he was the host. They all were. They viewed my generosity not as a gift, but as a debt I owed them for the privilege of being part of their family tree. They had mistaken my patience for a lack of self-respect. They thought that, because I didn't complain, I didn't notice the way they sneered when I walked out of the room. My upbringing had taught me to give until it hurts, but it also taught me to recognize when someone is just trying to see how much blood they can get out of a stone. I looked at the dark road ahead and felt a cold, sharp clarity settle over me. I realized I wasn't a wife to them. I was an interest-free loan with a cleaning habit. And today, the bank was closing. The house was finally quiet when I let myself into the office and locked the door. Mark had fallen into a deep, scotch-heavy sleep, probably dreaming of the fake accolades he'd collected at the party. I sat in the dark for a moment, the only light coming from the dual monitors on my desk. These screens had been my sanctuary, the place where I built my own success, while the rest of the family treated me like a glorified secretary. I felt a strange, detached calm as I began to open the folders I had been populating for years. I wasn't just looking at numbers anymore. I was looking at the physical evidence of my own exploitation. I opened a new spreadsheet and titled it the Miller Recovery Ledger. It was time to see exactly what it cost to be the invisible woman in this family. I started with the big items. 2 years ago, Brenda had called me in tears, claiming a dental emergency that insurance wouldn't cover. She needed $20,000 for implants and reconstructive work. Mark had looked at me with those puppy dog eyes, promising he'd pay me back once his big contract closed. I pulled the bank transfer and noted the date. I then cross-referenced it with Brenda's social media from that same month. She hadn't gone to a dentist. She had taken her 3 best friends on a 10-day Mediterranean cruise. I entered the $20,000 into the column marked fraudulent medical request. My fingers felt steady as I moved to the next tab. Then there was Mark's brother, Todd. Todd was the quintessential failure who blamed the economy for his inability to hold a job for more than 3 weeks. When his car was about to be repossessed, I had stepped in to pay off the remaining $15,000. I was told it was a loan. I looked at the promissory note I'd had him sign, which he'd laughed at while scribbling his name. He hadn't made a single payment. Instead, he'd used the extra cash flow to upgrade his gaming rig and buy a designer watch that he wore to family dinners to show me how much better he was doing than a mere bookkeeper. I added $15,000 plus 4% interest to the ledger. The list went on and on, a relentless parade of entitlement. I found the invoice for my sister-in-law Sarah's wedding. She had insisted on 8 bridesmaids, all in custom-made silk dresses that cost $400 each. When the bill came due, she conveniently lost her credit card. I had covered the $3,200 just to stop the seamstress from crying in my living room. Sarah never mentioned it again, though she did make sure to tell everyone at the reception that I looked a bit tired in my off-the-rack gown. I added the dress cost, the catering deposit I'd covered, and the florist's late fees. I scrolled through years of smaller subsidies that I had previously dismissed as the price of being a good sport. There were the monthly grocery hauls for Brenda because her pension supposedly didn't cover organic produce. There were the utility bills for Todd's apartment that Mark had secretly diverted to our joint account, which I was the only one funding. There were the countless investments Mark had made into businesses that didn't exist, which were really just payments to a high-stakes poker group he frequented on Tuesday nights. As the rows filled up, the spreadsheet became a map of my own betrayal. Every cell represented a moment where I had chosen to be kind, and they had chosen to be greedy. I calculated the interest I would have earned if that money had stayed in my high-yield accounts. I factored in the inflation and the opportunity costs of the investments I had passed on to keep their heads above water. I wasn't being petty, I was being precise. For a family that claimed I didn't understand the world of high finance, they sure had spent a lot of time living off the dividends of my labor. I sat back and hit the autosum function. The number that blinked back at me was staggering. It was a life-changing sum for most people, a fortune built on the back of my silence and my misplaced loyalty. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. The total at the bottom of the spreadsheet was enough to buy a Ferrari. But wait until you see what I found in my husband's secret savings account. The following Monday morning, the silence in the house was the first thing that broke. Usually, I was up at 5, brewing a fresh pot of artisanal coffee for Mark, prepping his gym bag, and folding a load of laundry before my first conference call. But today, I stayed in bed until 9, watching the sunlight crawl across the ceiling. I heard Mark stumbling around in the kitchen, the familiar clatter of the empty coffee carafe hitting the counter. He called my name, his voice laced with that casual, morning irritation he used when his world wasn't perfectly lubricated for his arrival. I didn't answer. I simply rolled over and checked the confirmation email from the concierge service I'd hired. By noon, the house smelled like seared scallops and clarified butter. I had hired Chef Julian to prepare my meals for the week. He was currently in the kitchen, wearing a crisp white coat, meticulously plating a poached pear salad. When Mark walked in, his eyes went wide. He assumed, with that characteristic arrogance, that I had finally decided to throw him a bone after the party. He reached for a fork, but Julian politely informed him that this meal was specifically weighed and prepared for one person. Mark looked at me, his face flushing a deep, angry red. He asked me what the hell was going on and why there was a stranger in our kitchen while he hadn't even had a piece of toast yet. I didn't look up from my book. I told him that I was officially retired from domestic service. I told him that since my job was just a little hobby, I had decided to spend my time focusing on my own well-being instead of managing his. The outrage was instantaneous. He didn't ask if I was okay or if he had done something to upset me. He went straight for the jugular, calling me selfish and suggesting that the stress of my bookkeeping was finally making me lose my mind. He told me I was being unstable, that the Miller family didn't act this way, and that I was embarrassing him in front of the staff. By 2 o'clock, the phone started blowing up. Brenda had called 4 times. Apparently, I hadn't shown up to drop off her dry cleaning or pick up her specialized heart supplements. She left a voicemail that started with a fake, concerned tone and ended with her screaming that I was being vindictive and that Mark deserved a wife who knew how to respect her elders. Then came the text from Sarah, demanding to know why I had canceled the shared streaming accounts and the family gym membership. They weren't worried about my mental health, they were worried about their access to my credit card. I spent the afternoon behind the deadbolt of my office door. I had hired a locksmith at dawn to install a commercial-grade lock that required a biometric scan. Through the door, I could hear Mark pacing. He tried the handle, then started pounding on the wood. He was shouting that I was acting like a child, that he was the man of the house, and that I had no right to lock him out of any room in his own home. I sat at my desk, sipping a glass of chilled sparkling water, and watched the security feed. I saw him go to the fridge, realize it was empty of everything except my pre-prepared meals, which were locked in acrylic boxes, and lose his mind. The entitlement was a physical thing now, a heat radiating through the walls. For years, I had been the one smoothing over the rough edges of their lives, and the moment I stopped, they didn't see a woman in pain, they saw a broken appliance. They didn't see a human being, they saw a resource that had suddenly gone offline. Mark's frustration boiled over when he realized I wasn't going to come out and apologize for his hunger. My husband slammed his fist on the table demanding dinner. I handed him a menu for a local diner and told him to check his balance. Then my lawyer called. By 6 o'clock, the Miller family had staged what they called an intervention, but what I recognized as a firing squad. They were all there, gathered in the living room I had decorated and paid for, looking at me with a mixture of practiced pity and simmering rage. Brenda sat in the center of the sofa like a disgraced queen, her arms folded tightly over her chest. Mark stood by the fireplace, trying to look authoritative, while Sarah and Todd hovered near the bar, already pouring themselves drinks from my private reserve. They had summoned me downstairs to explain my erratic behavior, to demand an apology for the chef, the locks, and the general lack of subservience I had displayed over the last 48 hours. Mark started a speech about partnership and how my recent mental break was putting a strain on the family's reputation, but he was interrupted by a sharp, rhythmic knocking at the front door. I didn't move to get it. I just sat in the armchair, legs crossed, waiting. When no one else moved, Brenda huffed about the lack of manners in this house and went to the door, likely expecting a delivery or another servant to scold. Instead, she was met by Mr. Harrison, a man whose suit cost more than Mark's entire car and whose expression was as cold as a winter morning in the Alps. He didn't wait for an invitation. He walked into the living room, opened a leather briefcase, and placed a stack of documents on the coffee table. He introduced himself as the senior executor for the estate of my great-aunt, Evelyn Vance. The air in the room shifted. Mark tried to intervene, stepping forward to ask why a high-end estate lawyer was in our living room talking to his wife. Mr. Harrison didn't even look at him. He adjusted his glasses and began to read from a summary of the probate proceedings. He spoke with a clinical, detached precision that made every word hit like a physical weight. He started with the liquid assets. $14 million held in a trust that had been maturing for decades, now fully transferred to my name. Then came the real estate, a historic townhouse in the city, a sprawling summer estate in Maine, and the very property we were currently standing in, which Evelyn had quietly acquired the deed to through a holding company when the Millers almost lost it 5 years ago. As Mr. Harrison continued, the list of my new holdings grew to include a controlling interest in the logistics firm where I had been playing with spreadsheets for the last decade. It turned out I wasn't just a bookkeeper. I was now the primary shareholder. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the kind of silence that occurs right after a massive explosion, where the ears ring and the brain struggles to process the new reality. My husband's family, the people who had spent years treating me like a disposable commodity, were suddenly faced with the fact that I was the wealthiest person they had ever sat in a room with. I watched Brenda's face. The transition was fascinating. The mask of maternal disappointment crumbled, replaced by a raw, naked shock. She looked at the documents, then at the lawyer, then finally at me. She didn't look at me as a person, though. She looked at me as a jackpot. Todd and Sarah shared a look that was so transparent it was almost pathetic. They were already mentally spending the money, calculating how many car payments and designer bags $14 million could cover. Mark, ever the opportunist, took a deep breath and tried to change his posture. He moved away from the fireplace and toward my chair, his face softening into a look of feigned pride, as if he had somehow been the architect of this windfall. He reached out to put a hand on my shoulder, his voice dropping into a low, intimate register. He told the room that he always knew I was special, that he had always seen the potential in me, and that this was a victory for the Miller family. He actually used the word we. He said, "We are so blessed, and we need to figure out how to manage this new responsibility together." He looked at Mr. Harrison and asked if there were any immediate funds available for the family's needs. It was the most predatory display of greed I had ever witnessed, and yet it was perfectly in character for them. The room went silent. The ML dropped her wine glass, the red liquid staining the rug I had bought her for Christmas. Then, the most disgusting thing happened. They started smiling. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a heavy, judgmental fog into a sickeningly sweet display of affection. It was a masterclass in manipulation. Brenda, who only 10 minutes ago was screeching about my lack of respect, was suddenly at my side, her hand resting on my knee with a gentleness I hadn't felt in 6 years. She told me she always knew I had the elegance of a Vance, and that she was so relieved for me to finally have the security I deserved. Sarah began talking about a celebratory girl's trip to ring in my new fortune, and Mark actually tried to pour me a glass of my own wine, leaning down to whisper how proud he was of his smart, successful wife. They were circling me like sharks that had just smelled blood, but they didn't realize the blood in the water wasn't mine. It was theirs. I didn't smile back. I didn't lean into Mark's touch. I simply reached into the folder Mr. Harrison handed me and pulled out 4 thick, stapled packets. I placed them on the coffee table with a deliberate, heavy thud that cut through their chatter like a blade. I told them that before we discussed the future, we had to settle the past. I explained that I had spent the last 48 hours performing a forensic audit of the Miller family's lifestyle. Since they had spent the better part of a decade insisting that I was nothing more than a domestic asset and a hobbyist bookkeeper, I decided to take their assessment to its logical, professional conclusion. I handed the first packet to Brenda. It was titled Retroactive Domestic and Management Services, Year 1 through 6. I watched her eyes scan the first page. I had billed her for every hour I spent cleaning her home, every mile I drove to pick up her prescriptions, and every weekend I spent organizing her social calendar. I didn't use amateur rates. I used the standard hourly fee for a high-end estate manager and a professional cleaning service, calculated at time and a half for the holiday work she forced me to do. I included the $20,000 for the Mediterranean cruise she disguised as a dental emergency, now recalculated with a 5% annual interest rate compounded monthly. I handed the second packet to Sarah. It was an itemized invoice for her wedding expenses, the loaned rent money for her apartment, and the 8 custom bridesmaid dresses she'd never bothered to pay for. I told her that since she viewed me as the help, she should be familiar with how invoices work. I added a line item for the emotional labor of listening to her complain about her struggles while I was bankrolling her life. The total at the bottom of her page made her face go from a fake tan to a ghostly white. Next was Todd. I didn't even look at him as I tossed his packet onto his lap. It was the $15,000 car loan, plus the 3 years of utility bills I had discovered Mark was paying from our joint account without my consent. I told him the family discount had expired the moment he mocked my career at the anniversary party. I told him that in the real world, when you borrow money from a professional, you don't get to pay it back in, maybe next month's. Finally, I looked at Mark. I didn't give him a packet. I gave him a single sheet of paper. It was the audit of our joint account compared to my private earnings. It showed that he had contributed exactly 4% of our household expenses over the last 5 years, while secretly siphoning off over $100,000 to fund his gambling habit and his parents' vanity projects. I told him that I had been his silent ATM for long enough, but now the ATM was charging a massive withdrawal fee. The silence that followed was different from the one before. This wasn't the silence of shock, it was the silence of a trapped animal realizing the cage is electrified. Brenda was the first to find her voice. She tried to laugh it off, a shaky, high-pitched sound that lacked any of her usual conviction. I moved out of the house that very night. I didn't take much, just a single suitcase of clothes and my secondary laptop, leaving the rest of my life behind those biometric locks. I checked into a luxury suite at the St. Regis, a place where the doors are heavy and the staff is trained to keep the world at bay. It was the first time in 6 years that I didn't have to listen for the sound of someone else's footsteps or anticipate someone else's hunger. I sat on the edge of the plush bed, the city lights shimmering through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and opened the security app on my phone. I knew them too well to think they would spend the night reflecting on their sins. They didn't have the capacity for guilt, but they had a limitless capacity for desperation. The office at the house wasn't just a room. To them, it had become a vault. They were convinced that the physical copies of the will, the estate deeds, and the legal packets I'd shown them were the source of my power. In their twisted, small-town logic, they believed that if they could just get their hands on those papers, they could find a loophole, a hidden clause, or perhaps just destroy the evidence of their own debt. They didn't understand that my wealth was digital, encrypted, and backed by a legal firm that specialized in high-stakes litigation. They were still playing checkers while I had already cleared the board. Around 2 a.m., the motion sensors in the hallway triggered. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I swiped to open the 4K feed. The image was crystal clear. I watched as Mark and Todd shuffled into the frame, their faces tight with a mixture of sweat and frantic energy. They weren't even trying to be quiet. They were whispering loudly, arguing about which one of them was supposed to have brought the crowbar. It was a pathetic sight, two grown men, dressed in their expensive clothes that I had paid for, preparing to commit a felony against the woman who had kept them fed for a decade. Mark tried the biometric scanner first. He pressed his thumb against the glass with a force that suggested he thought he could bully the machine into recognizing him. When the red light flashed and the soft chime of "access denied" echoed in the empty hallway, he let out a string of profanities that would have made his mother faint. He started kicking the base of the door, his expensive Italian loafers scuffing against the reinforced oak. Todd stepped forward then, wielding a heavy-duty pry bar he'd clearly taken from the garage. He jammed it into the door frame, his face turning a deep purple as he leaned his entire weight into the tool. The contrast was staggering. These were the men who looked down on me for my little bookkeeping job, yet here they were, reduced to common burglars because they couldn't conceive of a world where they had to earn their own keep. I watched them through the lens of the hidden camera, a bird's-eye view of their total moral collapse. Every strike against the door was a nail in the coffin of our marriage. Every whispered plan to shred the documents was being recorded in high definition, with professional-grade audio capturing every word of their intent. They thought they were taking their lives back. In reality, they were handing me the final piece of evidence I needed to ensure they never touched a penny of my inheritance. They didn't realize that the door was steel-reinforced and anchored directly into the floor joists. They didn't realize that the camera wasn't just recording, it was uploading in real time to a secure cloud server managed by my legal team. They were performing for an audience of one, and I was unimpressed. I leaned back against the silk pillows of my hotel bed, the blue light of the screen illuminating the cold, final smile on my face. I watched the live feed on my phone as they kicked the door in. I didn't call my husband. I called the sheriff. The sirens were the first thing the neighborhood heard, a sharp, wailing intrusion into the curated silence of our suburban street. From my hotel room, I watched the digital feed as 3 patrol cars screeched to a halt in the driveway, their blue and red lights painting the white columns of the house in a rhythmic, accusatory pulse. The irony was thick enough to choke on. For years, I had carefully managed the Miller family reputation, hiding their financial rot and Mark's failures behind a veil of polished perfection. I had been the shield that protected them from the consequences of their own nature. Tonight, I was the one pulling that shield away. The police didn't knock. They had the secondary access code I'd provided to the sheriff's department an hour earlier. I watched through the internal cameras as the officers moved into the hallway, their flashlights cutting through the dust Todd and Mark had kicked up during their frantic assault on my office door. The look on Mark's face when the officers rounded the corner was a masterpiece of shattered entitlement. He didn't drop the crowbar immediately. He held it like a scepter of his own stupidity, staring at the badges as if his last name alone would act as a magical incantation of immunity. He started to shout, his voice cracking with a high-pitched desperation that the body cams caught with perfect clarity. He told the officers that there had been a mistake, that he was the homeowner, and that his unstable wife was trying to frame him. But the law doesn't care about the stories entitled men tell themselves. The lead officer, a veteran who looked like he had zero patience for domestic dramas involving luxury real estate, informed him that the property was legally registered under a corporate trust belonging solely to me. He told Mark that he was currently an unauthorized intruder attempting to breach a secure room containing sensitive legal documents. The neighbors were already on their lawns. This was the suburbs, where a police siren is more effective than a dinner bell. I saw the glow of at least 5 different smartphones through the front door camera as the officers led Mark and Todd out in handcuffs. The Miller prestige was dissolving in real time, being uploaded to neighborhood group chats and local social media pages. Brenda appeared on the porch in her silk robe, screaming at the police to let her boys go, her face distorted by a rage that no longer had any power to hurt me. She looked small, frantic, and utterly exposed. The humiliation was no longer mine to carry. For 6 years, I had walked 2 steps behind them, playing the role of the quiet, unremarkable wife while they basked in the glow of my hard work. Now, the roles were finally, irrevocably reversed. Mark was sobbing now, the bravado of the executive replaced by the whimpering of a man who realized the safety net had been cut. He looked toward the driveway, perhaps hoping I was sitting in my car, waiting to swoop in and save him one last time. But the driveway was empty. I was miles away, watching the collapse of his world from a place of absolute security. As he was being put into the cruiser, he yelled that I couldn't do this to family. My lawyer stepped forward with a single piece of paper that changed his life forever. 2 weeks later, the morning air felt crisp and final. I stood on the sidewalk across the street, leaning against the door of my new car, watching the sun hit the windows of the house I used to call home. But it wasn't a home anymore. It was just an asset that had reached its maturity date. While Mark was busy dealing with the legal fallout of his late-night burglary, I had closed the sale on the property. I didn't sell it to a family looking for a fresh start. I sold it to a high-volume real estate investment group known for their zero-tolerance property management. They weren't interested in the Miller family legacy or Brenda's delicate sensibilities. They were interested in vacant possession, and they were 30 minutes early. I watched as a white van pulled into the driveway, followed closely by a sheriff's deputy and a crew of 4 men in orange vests. This was the moment the reality of my little bookkeeping hobby finally landed on their doorstep. Brenda was the first to emerge, her hair unkempt and her face a mask of bewildered fury. She started to scream at the men, telling them they were on private property and that her son would have them fired by noon. The lead man didn't even look at her. He simply handed the deputy a copy of the new deed and the court-ordered eviction notice I had fast-tracked through my legal team. The sound of the front door being forced open for the second time in a month echoed across the street. This time, however, it wasn't a desperate husband with a crowbar. It was the cold, efficient machinery of the law. I watched as the crew began to bring out the furniture. Piece by piece, the life I had funded was dismantled and deposited onto the curb. There was the mahogany dining table where I had served countless meals while being ignored. There was the designer sofa where Brenda used to sit while she critiqued my wardrobe. It all looked different under the harsh, direct light of the sun, cheaper, smaller, and remarkably pathetic. Mark arrived in a beat-up rental car just as his treadmill was being dumped onto the grass. He looked haggard, his designer suit wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot. He ran toward the house, shouting that this was illegal, that he had spousal rights, and that I couldn't sell the roof over his head. The deputy intercepted him before he could reach the porch, calmly explaining that the house had never been marital property. It had been owned by a trust that Mark had never been a part of. Mark stood there, paralyzed, watching as a stranger hauled his collection of vintage watches out in a plastic bin. The neighbors, the same ones who had watched me play the part of the invisible servant for years, were out on their porches again. This time, there was no pity in their eyes. There was only the rapt attention of people watching a long-overdue debt being collected. Brenda saw me then. She broke away from the deputy and stumbled across the street, her heels clicking unevenly on the asphalt. She didn't look like the matriarch of the Miller family anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally realized that the person she had been kicking for a decade was the only one who had been holding her up. She reached me, gasping for breath, her hands shaking as she tried to grab my arm. She didn't lead with an apology, she led with a demand. She told me that Mark was in trouble, that the legal fees were eating them alive, and that they had nowhere to go. She talked about the big new mansion she'd heard I'd purchased on the other side of the city. She actually had the audacity to suggest that, as family, it was my duty to take them in until they got back on their feet. She talked about how much she had always loved me, how she had always seen me as the daughter she never had, and how we could put all this unpleasantness behind us. I looked at her, and for the first time in 6 years, I felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no guilt, no desire to fix the mess she had made. I looked past her at Mark, who was sitting on the curb with his head in his hands, surrounded by the trash of his own making. The Miller name was officially worth nothing, and the woman who had built their world was finally walking out of the frame. I checked my watch, noted that the eviction was proceeding on schedule, and turned toward my car. The ML begged me for a room in my new mansion. I told her I had plenty of space, but I already hired a maid, and she didn't meet the qualifications. The air here smells like salt and expensive cedar, a far cry from the stale tension of the Miller household. I am sitting in the library of my new home, looking out at a private stretch of coastline that no one can enter without my express permission. It is remarkably quiet when you aren't listening for the next demand or the next insult disguised as a joke. My divorce was finalized 3 days ago. Mark, ever the optimist in his own delusion, tried to sue me for lifelong spousal support. He argued that he had become accustomed to a certain standard of living that I was obligated to maintain. My legal team met his demand with the second phase of the audit. We didn't just show the judge my inheritance, we showed the court the itemized history of Mark's financial abuse. We presented the records of the secret gambling debts, the siphoned funds, and the high-definition footage of him breaking into my office with a crowbar. When the judge saw the sheer volume of what I had contributed versus the systematic theft Mark had perpetrated, the request for support wasn't just denied, it was laughed out of the room. Mark walked away with exactly what he brought into the marriage, nothing but the clothes on his back and a reputation that is now radioactive in this city. Brenda and the rest of the clan are currently living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment that Todd's latest girlfriend is paying for. I heard through the grapevine that they are already fighting over who gets the sofa. It's funny how quickly family loyalty dissolves when there isn't a bank account to keep it lubricated. I don't feel a shred of regret. I learned that kindness is a gift, not a permanent resource, and when you treat a provider like a servant, you lose the right to the harvest. I spent years being the bigger person, but being the bigger person just means you're an easier target for people who don't want to grow up. Never mistake someone's kindness for a lack of options. I always had the door. I just finally decided to walk through it. If you think I was too harsh, wait until you hear what happened to my sister who tried to mediate the situation.